On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. The operation involved approximately 156,000 troops in the initial assault. It is remembered as the largest amphibious invasion in history and the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany in Western Europe. 17 days later, on June 23, 1944, the Soviet Union launched an offensive on the Eastern Front that dwarfed D-Day in every measurable category. Operation Bagration committed 2.3 million Soviet troops, supported by 5,200 tanks and 5,300 aircraft, against German Army Group Center. Within 5 weeks, the Wehrmacht lost 28 divisions, over 400,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The offensive advanced 600 kilometers, liberated Belarus, and brought Soviet forces to the borders of Warsaw and East Prussia. In terms of scale, speed, and strategic consequence, Bagration was the single most devastating defeat inflicted on the German military in World War II. Yet, if you ask an educated American to name the most important military operation of summer 1944, the answer will almost certainly be D-Day. Bagration, despite its vastly larger scope and impact, remains virtually unknown outside specialist military history circles. This is not an accident. It is the result of Cold War narratives, Western media focus, and the institutional suppression of Eastern Front history in Anglophone education. The operation that destroyed Army Group Center and irreversibly altered the trajectory of the European war has been erased from popular memory. This analysis examines the planning, execution, and consequences of Operation Bagration. It explains why the Soviet offensive succeeded where previous operations had stalled, how Soviet deception operations achieved total surprise, and why the catastrophic German defeat has been systematically ignored in Western historiography. The facts are documented, declassified, and unambiguous. What remains is the question of why they are unknown. By June 1944, Germany was fighting a two-front war it could not sustain. In the West, Allied forces had achieved air superiority over France and massed invasion forces in southern England. In the East, the Red Army had liberated most of Ukraine and was advancing toward the pre-1939 Soviet border. German strategic reserves were finite. Every division committed to one theater weakened the other. German High Command faced a resource allocation problem with no satisfactory solution. Intelligence assessments predicted a major Allied landing in France, but the timing and location remained uncertain. Simultaneously, Soviet offensives in early 1944 had demonstrated the Red Army's growing operational capability. The question was not whether the Soviets would attack, but where. German planners assumed the next Soviet offensive would occur in Ukraine, continuing the advance toward the Balkans and threatening Romanian oil fields at Ploiesti. This assumption was supported by visible Soviet preparations south of the Pripyat marshes, including troop concentrations, supply depots, and bridging equipment along river crossings. Reinforcements were therefore directed to Army Group North Ukraine, defending the approaches to southern Poland and the Carpathian Mountains. Panzer divisions and mobile reserves were positioned to counter the expected thrust. Army Group Center, holding a 700-kilometer front in Belarus, was treated as a secondary theater. The sector was considered stable. The terrain, heavily forested, swampy, and crossed by numerous rivers, was judged unsuitable for large-scale mechanized operations. German commanders expected Army Group Center to conduct an economy-of-force mission, holding the line with minimal resources while reserves were committed elsewhere. This assessment was both logical and catastrophically wrong. Army Group Center controlled 38 divisions, but many were under strength, short of mobile reserves, and equipped with obsolete or captured weapons. The Army Group's frontline trace formed a salient bulging eastward around Vitebsk and Bobruisk, with flanks resting on natural obstacles, Lake Narosh in the north and the Pripyat marshes in the south. The operational geography created conditions ideal for encirclement. Soviet planners recognized the vulnerability. Stavka, the Soviet High Command, identified Army Group Center as the weakest link in the German defensive system and the most suitable target for a large-scale offensive. A breakthrough in Belarus would sever the rail lines connecting central Germany with the Baltic states, isolate Army Group North, and open a direct route to East Prussia. The strategic objective was not simply to defeat Army Group Center, but to destroy it as a coherent fighting force, creating a gap in the German line that could not be closed. By mid-June 1944, the operational conditions favored a Soviet offensive in Belarus. The question was whether the Red Army could concentrate sufficient force without detection and whether Soviet logistics could sustain a deep penetration. Both conditions would soon be tested. The planning for Operation Bagration began in April 1944, when Stavka convened senior commanders to discuss summer offensive operations. The directive from Stalin and the General Staff was unambiguous. The Red Army would conduct a major offensive to coincide with the expected Allied invasion of France, forcing Germany to fight simultaneously on two fronts and preventing the transfer of reserves from east to west. The operational concept was developed by Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, Chief of the General Staff, and Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Deputy Supreme Commander. Their plan called for a coordinated offensive by four fronts: First, Baltic Front; Third, Belarusian Front; Second, Belarusian Front; and First Belarusian Front, against Army Group Center. The offensive would strike simultaneously at multiple points along the German front, achieving breakthroughs on the flanks and encircling German forces in a series of concentric operations. The plan reflected the maturation of Soviet operational doctrine. Early in the war, Soviet offensives had often achieved initial success, but failed to exploit breakthroughs due to poor coordination, inadequate logistics, and the inability to sustain momentum over extended distances. By 1944, the Red Army had refined the concept of deep operations, emphasizing the use of mobile groups, tank corps, and mechanized brigades to penetrate enemy defenses, bypass strongpoints, and drive toward operational objectives in the rear. The goal was not simply to push the enemy back, but to encircle and destroy him. Bagration was designed around this doctrine. The offensive would begin with a massive artillery preparation to suppress German defenses and disrupt command and control. Rifle divisions would breach the German front line, creating corridors for exploitation forces. Mobile groups would then advance rapidly, cutting German supply lines and isolating frontline units. Once encirclements were achieved, follow-on forces would reduce the pockets, while exploitation forces continued westward. The plan identified four primary axes of attack. In the north, First Baltic Front and Third Belarusian Front would strike toward Vitebsk, encircling German forces defending the city. In the center, Second Belarusian Front would pin German units in place, preventing reinforcement of threatened sectors. In the south, First Belarusian Front would attack toward Bobruisk, encircling German forces and opening the route to Minsk. The ultimate objective was the liberation of Minsk and the destruction of Army Group Center as an operational entity. Success depended on three factors: achieving surprise through deception, concentrating overwhelming force at the points of attack, and sustaining the offensive logistically over hundreds of kilometers. Stavka addressed each requirement systematically. Deception operations would conceal the buildup in Belarus and mislead German intelligence. Artillery, armor, and ammunition would be stockpiled in forward areas under strict camouflage discipline. Logistics units would pre-position fuel, food, and spare parts along projected axes of advance. The timeline was compressed. The offensive was scheduled to begin on June 23rd, less than 3 weeks after the anticipated Allied landing in France. This timing was deliberate. A simultaneous offensive on the Eastern Front would prevent Germany from concentrating reserves against either threat. Stavka committed over 2.3 million troops, 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, 5,300 aircraft, and 36,000 artillery pieces to the operation. It was the largest Soviet offensive of the war to that point. The plan was approved in early May. Execution would depend on whether the Red Army could move and conceal this force without German intelligence detecting the buildup. The success of Operation Bagration required total surprise. Soviet forces outnumbered German defenders along the intended axes of attack, but the advantage would collapse if Army Group Center received advance warning and repositioned reserves or withdrew to prepared defenses in depth. Soviet operational security therefore depended on Maskirovka, military deception, executed at a scale unprecedented in modern warfare. The deception plan was multi-layered and comprehensive. The primary objective was to convince German intelligence that the next Soviet offensive would occur in Ukraine, not Belarus. To achieve this, Soviet forces in Ukraine were ordered to simulate offensive preparations. Dummy fuel depots were constructed. Bridging equipment was assembled along river crossings. Reconnaissance patrols increased in frequency. Radio traffic simulated the movement of armored formations toward the Carpathian Mountains. German aerial reconnaissance photographed what appeared to be a major buildup south of the Pripyat marshes. Simultaneously, the actual concentration of forces in Belarus was conducted under the strictest operational discipline. All troop movements occurred at night. Units were prohibited from using roads within 20 kilometers of the front during daylight hours. Vehicles were camouflaged and dispersed in forests. Radio silence was enforced for all formations preparing for the offensive. Communications were conducted exclusively by courier or landline telephone. Artillery units were positioned in concealed locations and forbidden from conducting registration fires that might alert German observation posts. Soviet engineers constructed false defensive positions in Belarus to reinforce the impression that forces in the sector were preparing to receive a German offensive, not launch one. Trenches were dug in visible locations, obstacles were emplaced. Dummy tanks and artillery pieces were positioned in assembly areas observable from German lines. The deception extended to the strategic level. Soviet diplomatic channels hinted at potential offensives in the Balkans, and force intelligence was fed to German agents through double agents controlled by Soviet counterintelligence. The logistics buildup was equally concealed. Ammunition, fuel, and supplies were transported at night and stored in underground depots or camouflaged dumps. Rail movements were staggered to avoid creating identifiable patterns. Tank units remained in rear areas until the final 48 hours before the offensive, moving forward only under cover of darkness. The forests and swamps of Belarus provided natural concealment that would have been impossible in the open terrain of Ukraine. German intelligence failed completely. Aerial reconnaissance detected no unusual activity. Signals intelligence reported normal radio traffic consistent with defensive operations. Prisoner interrogations and deserter reports provided no indication of offensive preparations. German Army Group Center headquarters, evaluating the sector on June 20th, 3 days before the offensive, assessed the situation as stable and unlikely to change. The operational surprise achieved by Soviet Maskirovka was total. The deception succeeded because it exploited German assumptions, maintained strict discipline across millions of personnel, and leveraged terrain to conceal movements. When the offensive began on June 23rd, German commanders initially interpreted the attacks as local actions, not a coordinated operation involving 4 fronts and over 160 divisions. By the time the scale of the offensive became clear, Soviet forces had already achieved decisive breakthroughs. Maskirovka had delivered the precondition for operational success. Operation Bagration commenced at 0400 hours on June 23, 1944, with a coordinated artillery barrage along the entire front held by Army Group Center. The preparatory bombardment involved over 31,000 guns and mortars and lasted approximately 2 hours. The fires targeted German command posts, communication nodes, artillery positions, observation posts, and forward defensive positions. The scale and intensity of the bombardment was unprecedented on the Eastern Front. Simultaneously, Soviet aviation conducted strikes against German rear area targets. Airfields, supply depots, rail junctions, and bridges were bombed to disrupt German logistics and prevent the movement of reserves. Soviet air superiority, achieved through months of attrition and the destruction of the Luftwaffe's fighter force, allowed these operations to proceed with minimal interference. The ground assault began immediately following the artillery preparation. Soviet rifle divisions advanced on narrow breakthrough sectors, concentrating overwhelming force against isolated segments of the German line. German defenders, stunned by the bombardment and unable to coordinate responses due to severed communications, were overrun in the initial assault. By the end of the first day, Soviet forces had achieved penetrations of 10 to 15 kilometers on multiple axes. In the north, 1st Baltic Front and 3rd Belarusian Front struck toward Vitebsk, defended by German 53rd Corps. The German defensive line, weakened by the diversion of reserves to Ukraine, could not withstand the assault. Soviet forces broke through on both flanks of the city, threatening encirclement. German 53 Corps requested permission to withdraw. Hitler's standing order prohibiting retreats without express authorization delayed the response. By the time permission was granted on June 25th, Soviet mobile forces had already closed the encirclement. 5 German divisions, approximately 35,000 men, were trapped in the Vitebsk pocket. In the south, 1st Belarusian Front attacked toward Bobruisk, defended by elements of German 9th Army. The assault followed the same pattern: concentrated artillery preparation, rapid penetration by rifle divisions, and exploitation by mobile groups. Soviet forces broke through the German defensive line and advanced toward the city from multiple directions. By June 27th, Bobruisk was encircled. Approximately 70,000 German troops were trapped in the pocket. In the center, 2nd Belarusian Front conducted supporting attacks to pin German 4th Army in place and prevent lateral movement of reserves. These attacks, while not achieving breakthroughs of the same depth, succeeded in fixing German forces and preventing them from reinforcing threatened sectors. German commanders recognized the scale of the disaster by June 25th. Army Group Center headquarters requested authorization to withdraw to defensible positions along the Berezina River, approximately 100 kilometers west of the front line. The request was denied. Hitler insisted that all positions be held. The order was militarily inapplicable. The breakthrough had already occurred, and Soviet mobile forces were operating in the German rear. German units attempting to hold their positions were bypassed and encircled. By June 27th, the German defensive front in Belarus had collapsed. The Vitebsk and Bobruisk encirclements had destroyed or isolated 10 divisions. Gaps in the German line exceeded 100 kilometers in width. Soviet exploitation forces, tank corps and mechanized brigades, were advancing westward with minimal resistance. The breakthrough phase of Operation Bagration had succeeded beyond Stavka's initial projections. The question now was whether Soviet forces could sustain the offensive and complete the destruction of Army Group Center before German reserves could stabilize the front. Following the breakthrough, Soviet exploitation forces drove west toward Minsk, the logistical and communications hub of Army Group Center. The objective was to encircle the remnants of German 4th Army before it could withdraw to defensible positions. Soviet mobile groups advanced on converging axes, bypassing German strongpoints and cutting rail lines and roads. German 4th Army, positioned in the center of the front, had been fixed in place by 2nd Belarusian Front's supporting attacks during the initial breakthrough. As Soviet forces advanced on the flanks, 4th Army found itself in a deteriorating operational position. Withdrawal was necessary, but the routes west were already under threat from Soviet mobile forces.
German commanders requested permission to retreat. Authorization was delayed. By the time the order was issued, Soviet forces had already severed the primary withdrawal routes. On June 29th, elements of 3rd Belarusian Front advancing from the north and 1st Belarusian Front advancing from the south linked up east of Minsk. The encirclement was complete. Approximately 105,000 German troops from 4th Army were trapped in the pocket. German units attempted to break out toward the west, but Soviet blocking forces and air interdiction defeated these efforts. The Luftwaffe, lacking the strength to provide effective air support, could not prevent Soviet aircraft from attacking German columns. Soviet forces tightened the encirclement, while follow-on rifle divisions reduced the pocket. German troops, short of ammunition, fuel, and food, fought in isolated pockets with diminishing effectiveness. Organized resistance within the Minsk encirclement collapsed by July 8th. Approximately 70,000 German soldiers were killed or captured. The remainder, wounded, scattered, or in small groups, either surrendered in the following days or attempted to infiltrate westward through Soviet lines. The destruction of 4th Army represented the annihilation of a field army as an operational entity. The units trapped in the pocket included corps headquarters, divisional staffs, artillery regiments, and logistics formations. The loss of these command and support elements crippled Army Group Center's ability to reconstitute defensive positions, even if personnel replacements could be provided. Simultaneously, Soviet forces liquidated the smaller encirclements at Vitebsk and Bobruisk. At Vitebsk, the 5 trapped divisions attempted breakouts on June 26th and 27th. Soviet forces repelled the attempts and destroyed the pocket by June 27th. Fewer than 8,000 German soldiers escaped. The remainder were killed or captured. At Bobruisk, the encircled forces held out until June 29th before collapsing. Approximately 50,000 German troops were killed or captured in the Bobruisk pocket. By early July, Army Group Center had lost 28 divisions. 17 divisions were destroyed outright. 11 divisions were reduced to remnants with no combat capability. The Wehrmacht's casualty figures exceeded 300,000 killed, wounded, or captured in the first 2 weeks of the offensive. Material losses included approximately 2,000 tanks and assault guns, 10,000 artillery pieces, and 57,000 vehicles. The losses were irreplaceable. Germany no longer possessed the industrial capacity or manpower reserves to reconstitute forces on this scale. Soviet forces liberated Minsk on July 3, 1944. The offensive, however, did not stop. Exploitation forces continued westward, crossing the Berezina River and advancing toward the Polish border. The operational objective, destruction of Army Group Center, had been achieved. The strategic question was how far the Red Army could advance before logistics and German reinforcements forced a halt. Following the destruction of the Minsk pocket, Soviet forces continued the offensive westward. The operational objective shifted from encirclement to exploitation, advancing as rapidly as possible to seize strategic terrain and prevent the Germans from establishing a new defensive line. By early July, Soviet mobile groups had crossed the Berezina River and were approaching the pre-1939 Polish-Soviet border. The advance proceeded on multiple axes. In the north, 3rd Belarusian Front drove towards Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, threatening the rear of German Army Group North. In the center, 2nd Belarusian Front advanced towards Bialystok and Grodno. In the south, 1st Belarusian Front pushed towards Brest-Litovsk and the Bug River. The pace of the advance averaged 20 to 30 kilometers per day, unprecedented for sustained operations over such distances. German resistance, while disorganized, did not cease. Remnants of Army Group Center, reinforced by divisions transferred from Army Group North Ukraine and Western Europe, attempted to establish defensive lines along successive river barriers.
These efforts were hampered by the absence of prepared positions, the lack of coordination between scattered units, and the continued pressure from Soviet forces. German counterattacks, launched piecemeal and without adequate armored support, were defeated by Soviet combined arms tactics and air superiority. Soviet logistics, however, were approaching their limits. The offensive had advanced over 500 kilometers in 3 weeks. Supply lines stretched across devastated terrain with limited rail capacity and destroyed bridges. Fuel shortages began to affect mobile units. Ammunition expenditure, particularly for artillery, had been enormous, and forward depots were running low. The Red Army's logistical system, while improved from earlier in the war, was not capable of sustaining offensives at this tempo indefinitely. Despite these constraints, Soviet forces continued to advance. On July 13th, 3rd Belarusian Front captured Vilnius. On July 18th, 1st Belarusian Front reached the outskirts of Brest-Litovsk. By late July, Soviet forces had crossed the Bug River and were advancing on Warsaw. The offensive had penetrated over 600 kilometers from its starting positions, the deepest Soviet advance of the war to that point. The advance toward Warsaw presented both an opportunity and a challenge. Warsaw was a major political and logistical objective, but Soviet forces were exhausted, undersupplied, and facing stiffening German resistance. German reinforcements, including panzer divisions withdrawn from France and Italy, were arriving to stabilize the front. Soviet commanders recognized that continuing the offensive without pausing for resupply risked overextension and counterattack. On July 28th, elements of 2nd Tank Army reached the Vistula River near Warsaw, but were unable to secure crossings against determined German resistance. Soviet forces established bridgeheads on the western bank, but lacked the strength to expand them. The offensive, after 5 weeks of continuous operations, began to lose momentum. By early August, the front stabilized along the Vistula and Nero rivers. Soviet forces held positions deep inside pre-war Poland and on the borders of East Prussia. The advance had liberated Belarus, eastern Poland, and parts of Lithuania. Army Group Center had been destroyed as a coherent force. But the operational limits of the Red Army's logistical system had been reached. The offensive paused as Soviet forces consolidated, resupplied, and prepared for future operations. The exploitation phase of Operation Bagration was complete. The question now was what strategic impact the offensive had achieved and how Germany would respond to the catastrophic defeat. The destruction of Army Group Center had immediate and cascading strategic consequences for Germany. The Wehrmacht had lost the equivalent of an entire army group, 28 divisions, over 400,000 men, and irreplaceable equipment. The loss created a gap in the Eastern Front that could not be closed with available reserves. Germany was now fighting a two-front war with insufficient forces to contain either offensive. The most immediate consequence was the isolation of Army Group North. This formation, defending the Baltic states, depended on overland rail connections through Belarus to supply its 26 divisions. The Soviet advance to Vilnius and the Baltic coast severed these connections. Army Group North was cut off and dependent on sea supply through ports increasingly vulnerable to Soviet air and naval interdiction. German High Command faced the choice of withdrawing the Army Group, abandoning the Baltic states, or leaving it in place at risk of encirclement. Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal. Army Group North remained isolated until January 1945, when a corridor was briefly reopened during German counterattacks in East Prussia. The loss of Belarus also disrupted Germany's logistical network. The rail lines connecting central Germany with the northern Eastern Front passed through Minsk and Vilnius. These were now in Soviet hands. Reinforcements and supplies destined for Army Group North had to be rerouted through circuitous and vulnerable routes. The rail capacity available to support operations on the Eastern Front was reduced by approximately 30%. Germany responded to the crisis by transferring divisions from other theaters. Panzer divisions earmarked for the defense of France were diverted east in July 1944. Infantry divisions were withdrawn from Norway, Italy, and the Balkans.
These redeployments weakened German resistance in Western Europe at a critical moment. The Allied breakout from Normandy in late July, Operation Cobra, benefited directly from the absence of German armored reserves that had been sent to the Eastern Front. Germany's ability to conduct mobile defense in the West was crippled by the need to stabilize the East. The offensive also brought the Red Army to the borders of Germany itself. East Prussia, the historic heartland of the Prussian state and the birthplace of the German military tradition, was directly threatened. Soviet forces were positioned less than 100 kilometers from Königsberg. The psychological impact on the German population and leadership was profound. The Eastern Front, previously hundreds of kilometers from German territory, was now at the doorstep. For the Soviet Union, Bagration validated the operational doctrine refined over 3 years of combat. The Red Army demonstrated the ability to conduct multi-front offensives with precise coordination, achieve total surprise through deception, sustain advances over vast distances, and destroy enemy forces through encirclement. Soviet casualties, approximately 180,000 killed and wounded, were significant but acceptable given the scale of German losses. The exchange ratio heavily favored the attackers.
Politically, the offensive strengthened the Soviet Union's position in post-war negotiations. The advance to the Vistula placed the Red Army in control of eastern Poland and positioned Soviet forces to dominate Eastern Europe. The balance of power on the continent had shifted decisively. Germany's defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. Operation Bagration was the operational and strategic turning point of 1944. It destroyed Germany's ability to defend the Eastern Front, isolated major formations, disrupted logistics, forced the diversion of reserves from other theaters, and brought the Red Army to the borders of the Reich. The Eastern Front, which had consumed the majority of German military resources since 1941, was collapsing. Germany's defeat was now inevitable. The obscurity of Operation Bagration in Western historical consciousness is not proportional to its significance. It is the result of deliberate institutional, political, and cultural forces that shaped post-war historiography and collective memory. The Eastern Front, where the majority of World War II's combat occurred and where Germany's military power was broken, has been systematically marginalized in Anglophone education and popular culture. The marginalization began during the war itself. Operation Bagration commenced on June 23, 1944, 17 days after D-Day. Western media coverage was dominated by the Normandy invasion, the liberation of France, and the advance of American and British forces toward Germany. Newsreels, newspapers, and radio broadcasts focused almost exclusively on the Western Front. The Soviet offensive, occurring simultaneously 2,000 kilometers to the east, received minimal attention. Western correspondents had limited access to the Eastern Front, and Soviet authorities tightly controlled information releases. The result was that Bagration, despite its scale, was barely reported in real time. After the war, Cold War geopolitics reinforced this imbalance. The Soviet Union transitioned from wartime ally to ideological and military adversary. In the United States and Western Europe, celebrating Soviet military achievements became politically problematic. Historical narratives were reframed to emphasize Western contributions to victory. Textbooks, films, and documentaries focused on D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, the liberation of Paris, and the discovery of concentration camps by American forces. The Eastern Front was reduced to simplified accounts of Stalingrad and the fall of Berlin, with little discussion of the operational campaigns that destroyed the Wehrmacht as a fighting force. Western historiography relied heavily on German military records and memoirs written by former Wehrmacht officers. These sources, while valuable, were shaped by the author's perspectives and incentives. German generals writing in the post-war period emphasized their own competence and attributed defeats to Hitler's interference, material inferiority, or the vast numbers of Soviet troops. The operational skill of the Red Army was downplayed or ignored. Soviet doctrine, planning, and execution were dismissed as products of numerical superiority rather than institutional learning and adaptation. Western historians, skeptical of Soviet sources due to Cold War tensions and Soviet politicization of history, accepted these German accounts with insufficient critical scrutiny. Soviet historiography contributed to the problem. Soviet accounts of the war emphasized the role of the Communist Party, Stalin's leadership, and ideological factors, often distorting operational details to fit political narratives. Western historians, encountering these propagandistic accounts, dismissed Soviet sources entirely, rather than attempting to separate factual military history from ideological framing.
The result was that serious study of Soviet operations was delayed until the 1980s and 1990s, when historians such as David Glantz and Richard Overy began systematic analysis of Soviet military records. Educational systems in the West perpetuated the imbalance. University courses on World War II devote weeks to the Normandy campaign and hours, if any, to the Eastern Front. High school curricula mention Stalingrad, but rarely address the operational campaigns of 1943 and 1944. Popular histories, films, and television series focus almost exclusively on American and British operations. The Eastern Front, where 80% of German military casualties occurred, is treated as a peripheral theater. The result is a distorted understanding of how Nazi Germany was defeated. The popular narrative credits American industrial power, British resolve, and the Normandy invasion, while marginalizing or ignoring the Soviet Union's role. Operation Bagration, the largest, most successful, and strategically decisive offensive of 1944, remains unknown to the general public. The operation that destroyed Army Group Center, opened the road to Berlin, and forced Germany to fight a two-front war it could not win, has been erased from collective memory. What remains is a version of history that privileges Western agency and obscures the reality of the war's Eastern Front.